Thank you. I want to talk about civil rights tonight because I believe gay rights are civil rights. As my late neighbor and friend, Coretta Scott King, said in 1998, homophobia is like racism and anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry, in that it seeks to dehumanize a large group of people, to deny their humanity, their dignity, and their personhood. And in 2000, she added, we have a lot more work to do in our common struggle against bigotry and discrimination. I say common struggle because I believe very strongly that all forms of bigotry and discrimination are equally wrong and should be opposed by right-thinking Americans everywhere. Freedom from discrimination, she went on to say, based on sexual orientation, is surely a fundamental human right in any great democracy, as much as freedom from racial, religious, gender, or ethnic discrimination. That's why in 2006, the NAACP unanimously passed a resolution stating, we shall pursue all legal and constitutional means to support non-discriminatory policies and practices against persons based on race, gender, sexual orientation, nationality, or cultural background. We acted in this way in order to ensure equal protection under the law for all and to create a more civil and just society. It was because of this common struggle that in 2006, the South African Parliament legalized same-sex marriage. The Home Affairs Minister of the African National Congress argued, in breaking with our past, we need to fight and resist all forms of discrimination and prejudice, including homophobia. Black people, of all people, should not oppose equality, and that is what gay marriage is. So it does not matter the rationale, religious, cultural, pseudoscientific. No people of goodwill should oppose marriage equality, but oppose it they do, as we saw here in California last fall. So we all have work to do in terms of education and enlightenment. And at the NAACP, we pledge to do our part. Now, 2 years ago, we celebrated the 40th anniversary of a case aptly called Loving versus Virginia, which struck down anti-miscegenation laws and many, many years later allowed my wife and me to marry in the state that declares Virginia is for lovers. Then, as now, proponents of marriage as is wanted to amend the United States Constitution, introducing a constitutional amendment in 1911 to ban interracial marriage. Reverend Seaborn Roddenberry of my former home state of Georgia argued, intermarriage between whites and blacks is repulsive and adverse to every sentiment of pure American spirit. It is abhorrent and repugnant. It is subversive to social peace. It is destructive of moral supremacy. Sound familiar? Then, as now, proponents of marriage as is invoke God's plan. The trial judge who sentenced the Lovings said that when God created the races, he placed them on separate continents. The fact that he separated the races showed that he did not intend for the races to mix. Well, God seems to have made room in his plan for interracial marriage. And he or she will no doubt do the same for same-sex marriage. Now, no less an expert on the subject than Mildred Loving herself understood this. Widowed many, many years ago, Mildred Loving chose to live a very private life, turning down countless requests to be interviewed, to make appearances, to be honored. But on the 40th anniversary of the ruling, 3 members of Faith in America visited her seeking her support for gay marriage. She was undecided, and she remained so for several days. When she eventually agreed to allow her name to be used in support of gay marriage, she was asked, "Are you sure you understand you're putting your name behind the idea that 2 men or 2 women should have the right to marry each other?" Mildred Loving replied, "I understand it and I believe it." Now, the modern movement for civil rights has its immediate origins in the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board, decided in 1954. That ruling effectively ended segregation's legality, and it gave a nonviolent army the license to challenge segregation's morality as well. A year later, an NAACP activist in Montgomery refused to give up her seat on a bus so a white man could sit down. 5 years after Montgomery, 4 black young men, college students in Greensboro, refused to give up their seats at a dime store lunch counter reserved for whites. These small acts of passive resistance to American apartheid and the cumulative acts of tens of thousands more created a people's movement that eliminated legal segregation in less than a decade. Now, we ought not forget that Dr. King stood before and walked with thousands, the people who made this mighty movement what it was. From Jamestown's slave pens to Montgomery's boycotted buses, these ordinary women and men labored in obscurity. And from Montgomery forward, they provided the foot soldiers of the Freedom Army. They walked in dignity rather than ride in shame. They sat down at lunch counters so others could stand up. They marched and they organized. Dr. King didn't march from Selma to Montgomery by himself. There were thousands marching with him and before him, and thousands more who did the dirty work that preceded the triumphal march. The successful strategies of the modern movement for civil rights were litigation, organization, mobilization, and coalition, all aimed at creating a national constituency for civil rights. So sometimes it is the simplest of ordinary acts, sitting at a lunch counter, registering to vote, going to a new school, applying for a marriage license, that can change the way we think and act. That's why, when someone asks me, are gay rights civil rights, my answer is always, of course they are. Civil rights are positive legal prerogatives, the right to equal treatment before the law. These are the rights shared by everyone. There is no one in the United States who does not or should not enjoy or share in enjoying these rights. Gay and lesbian rights are not special rights in any way. It isn't special to be free from discrimination. It is an ordinary universal entitlement of citizenship. The right to not to be discriminated against is a commonplace claim we all expect to enjoy under our laws and our founding document, the Constitution. The fact that many had to struggle to gain these rights makes them precious. It does not make them special, and it does not reserve them only for me or restrict them from others. Because when others gain these rights, my rights are not diminished in any way. My rights are not diluted when my neighbor enjoys protection from discrimination. He or she becomes my ally in defending the rights we all share. For some people, comparisons between the African American civil rights movement, the movement for gay and lesbian rights, seems to diminish the long Black historical struggle with its suffering, sacrifices, and endless toil. However, people of color ought to be flattered that our movement has provided so much inspiration for others, that it has been, that our movement has been so widely imitated, that our tactics, our methods, our heroes, our heroines, and even our songs have been appropriated or served as models for others. Now, no parallel between movements is exact. African Americans are the only Americans who were enslaved for more than 2 centuries, and people of color carry the badge of who we are on our faces. But we are far from the only people suffering discrimination. Sadly, so do many others. And those others deserve the law's protection and civil rights too. Sexual disposition parallels race. Michael Steele said so yesterday. I was born black, and I had no choice. I couldn't change it, wouldn't change it if I could. Like race, our sexuality isn't a preference. It is immutable, it is unchangeable, and the Constitution protects us against prejudices and discrimination based on immutable differences. Now, many gays and lesbians worked side by side with me in the 1960s civil rights movement. Am I now to tell them thanks for risking life and limb helping me win my rights, but they're excluded because of a condition of their birth? That they can't share now in the victories they helped me to win? That having accepted and embraced them as partners in a common struggle, I can now turn my back on them, deny them the rights they helped me win, rights I enjoy because of them? Not a chance. No. Today, for better or worse, gay rights are embedded in the debate over marriage. One writer says conservative preachers and right-wing activists can't let go of gay marriage. They're still using its threat to traditional families to rally their parishioners, lest they forget to be judgmental and unwittingly slip into love and mercy. Now, the NAACP, whose board I chair, we don't take a position for or against of same-sex marriage, although I personally support the right of 2 people in love to marry and the many, many legal benefits of state-sanctioned marriage. But we believe it is always wrong to use a federal or state constitution to single out one group of people for discrimination. And we campaign from the top to the bottom of California against Proposition 8. You know, President Bush, you remember him, he said, marriage is the most fundamental institution of our civilization. Isn't that precisely why we should support, not oppose, gay marriage? We've amended the U.S. Constitution only 17 times since the adoption of the Bill of Rights. Aside from prohibition, which was quickly acknowledged to be a mistake and repealed, we've amended the Constitution only to expand and protect people's rights, never to restrict them, never to take them away. The proponents of these amendments argue they're a response to so-called activist judges, like those on the Supreme Court, whose activism interfered in the 2000 election process and crowned George W. Bush president. The real purpose of these amendments was and is to draw conservative voters to the polls, offering them the red meat that motivates so many Americans to cast their votes. But in a survey reported in the December 2004 issue of Facts and Trends magazine, when pastors were asked to name the #1 threat to the family, 43% named divorce, 38% named negative influences in the media, 36% cited materialism, 24% said absentee fathers, families without a stay-at-home parent were listed by 18%, pornography was a reason for 17%, morality not being taught in schools was mentioned by 14%, and poverty, unemployment, and a poor economy were mentioned by 13%. Same-sex marriage did not make the list. Now, we know there are many who base their support of these laws and their opposition to same-sex marriage on biblical inerrancy, on the proposition that Leviticus 18:22 prohibits homosexuality and God's law must be obeyed. Believers ought not to force their laws on people of different faiths or people of no faith at all. Marriage is a civil right. If you don't want gay people to marry in your church, okay. But you can't say they can't be married in City Hall because of your religious beliefs. What these people want, what these people want, what these people want is to install a Christian caliphate in America, replacing laws debated by men with laws dictated by religion. These are cafeteria Christians, picking a biblical injunction from column A while ignoring those from columns B through Z. Now, Leviticus 25:44 states, "I may possess many slaves, both male and female, provided they're purchased from neighboring nations." Does this apply to Mexicans and Canadians, or both? Now, Exodus 21:7 sanctions selling my daughter into slavery. I have two very pretty daughters. What would be a good price for the pair? Leviticus 15:19-24 forbids me from having contact with a woman while she's in her period of menstrual uncleanliness. The problem is, how do I tell? I've tried asking, but many women seem to take offense. Now, are there any here? And if so, should they be asked to leave? Now, my neighbors insist on working on the Sabbath. Exodus 35:2 clearly states they should be put to death. Am I morally obligated to kill them myself, or should I ask the police to do it? Leviticus 21 states I may not approach the altar of God if I have a defect in my sight. I have to admit, I wear glasses. Does my vision have to be 20/20, or is there some wiggle room here? My uncle has a farm. He violates Leviticus 19 by planting two different crops in the same field, as does his wife by wearing garments made of two different kinds of thread, usually a kind of cotton polyester blend. He also tends to curse and blaspheme a lot. Is it really necessary that we go to all of the trouble of getting the whole town together to stone them, as it says in Leviticus 21? Couldn't we just burn them to death at a private family affair, like we do with people who sleep with their in-laws, as in Leviticus 20:14? Now, black Christians and other Christians have always discarded scriptures that damned us in the name of religion, like the curse of Ham in Genesis 9:18, or supported slavery as in Ephesians 6:5. We should just as easily and just as eagerly discard those which marginalize others, because the God we believe made us made them too. We must not forget the powerful influence of religion, not Islam, but Christianity, in creating the image of the greedy Jew, the Christ killer. The extremist religious right represents more than a conservative force in our society. They are central to the contention that all things Christian are American and right. Things non-Christian, including Jews and homosexuals, are less American and wrong. But to its credit, the Jewish Theological Seminary, the center of conservative Judaism, now has joined Reform Jews in accepting gay rabbis. The black church in America has much to answer for harboring ugly homophobia and for a refusal to adopt a proactive stance against HIV and AIDS. 4 years ago, Atlanta Constitution editor-page editor Cynthia Tucker wrote, "Nowhere are the front lines in the battle against gay marriage tended with more care than in conservative black churches, where ministers regularly denounce homosexuality as an abomination. The disproportionate spread of HIV among black women can be traced directly to the covert world of black men on the down low. men who secretly engage in sex with other men while keeping girlfriends or wives and pointedly denying they are gay or bisexual. That underworld, meanwhile, have its roots in black homophobia, so virulent that these men are unwilling or unable to acknowledge their sexuality. In black America, homophobia spreads from our churches to our homes and our schools. Our inability to talk about sex, and more specifically about homosexuality, is the single greatest barrier to the prevention of AIDS transmission in our community. We have failed. We have failed to heed Martin Luther King's warning, originally meant for others but applicable to us now. Nothing in the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. And nowhere is this better illustrated than the response of some black clergy to the Matthew Shepard Act, which would have strengthened our nation's hate crime laws to include sexual orientation and gender identity. Somewhere in America, hate crime occurs once every hour. Churches are burned because of the people who attend them, or the God worship within. People are attacked because of who they are, what they look like, or where they were born. These crimes terrorize entire communities, and they turn back the clock on our hard-fought march of progress. Yet certain black ministers oppose the Matthew Shepard Act. They falsely claimed it would make it unlawful for them to preach against homosexuality. But unless a pastor was also holding a gun or brandishing another weapon, he can continue to be free to preach his noxious version of the Bible. Rampant homophobia is not just wrong, it's dangerous to our national security. The U.S. military spent more than $200 million to recruit and train personnel to replace the 10,000 troops discharged for being openly gay between 1993 and 2003. More than 300 language experts have been fired under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, including 50 Arab-speaking personnel whose skills were vital to the so-called war on terror. In '89, a Pentagon study concluded sexuality is unrelated to job performance in the same way as is being left or right-handed. Our fighting men and women, gay and straight, fight today beside troops from Australia, Britain, Italy, and Spain, all countries that permit gays to serve openly. No sooner had retired Army General John Shashkevili called for reconsideration of Don't Ask, Don't Tell last year than his successor as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Peter Pace, opined that were gays to serve openly, the military would be condoning immoral acts. But in 2007, 27 retired generals and admirals joined General Saakashvili in urging Congress to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, a position favored by President Obama, who compared it to the integration of blacks in the armed forces, not just an achievable goal, but a moral issue as well. General Peter Pace is being outpaced, and the world is changing around him. Ironically, as a majority of Californians were voting against equality in marriage, they and the majority of their fellow Americans were voting for the nation's first African-American president. His was a victory not just for a man, but for a movement. It proves that good things can come, not to those who wait, but to those who agitate. I began this speech with Coretta Scott King, and I want to close with a story about her and a friend of hers, a friend of mine from Atlanta, named Winston Johnson. Winston worked for Eastern Airlines. Part of his job was to shepherd celebrities as they passed through the Atlanta airport. One of them was Coretta Scott King. Winston met her on April 5th, 1968, as an Eastern Airlines plane carried her murdered husband's body home. 2 decades later, in 1988, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Bowers versus Hardwick, a case out of Atlanta, that Georgia's sodomy laws could be enforced against gay people. That decision prompted Winston and his partner to contact the Human Rights Campaign and become a part of the movement. Winston wanted to call his old friend, Coretta Scott King, to enlist her support. But first, he'd have to come out to her, which he had never done over their 20-year friendship. When he told her, he said, I'm telling you this because I want you to do something. To which she replied, you just tell me where and when, and I'll be there. That fall, Mrs. King first publicly supported gay rights, as she continued to do till her death in 2006. Now, my friend Winston, who says as a young gay person growing up, he just wanted to know that I was okay just like I was. We're all okay. And someday, marriage for all of us will be okay too. Thank you.